June 6, 1944. Sword Beach, Normandy, France. The largest amphibious invasion in human history is underway. Thousands of Allied soldiers are pouring onto French shores under withering German machine gun fire. The beach is chaos incarnate. Men are screaming, explosions are tearing through the morning air, and the ocean is literally red with blood. Among this mechanized hell, one British officer stands on the ramp of his landing craft doing something absolutely insane. He's playing the bagpipes. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, known to his men as Mad Jack, stands fully exposed to enemy fire, his pipes wailing a haunting Scottish melody across the battlefield. Strapped to his side is a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword. On his back, a longbow and a quiver of arrows. He's dressed in full combat uniform, but he looks like he stepped out of a medieval battlefield and wandered into the 20th century by mistake. As German bullets snap through the air around him, Mad Jack finishes his tune, draws his sword, raises it high above his head, and screams at his commandos to follow him into battle. Then he charges off that landing craft like he's leading a Highland clan against the English at Culloden, except the year is 1944, and the enemy has machine guns. This moment should have gotten him killed in the first 30 seconds. Instead, it defined one of the most bizarre military careers in modern warfare. Mad Jack Churchill would fight through the entire Second World War using weapons that were obsolete before Shakespeare was born, survive situations that should have killed him a dozen times over, and prove that sometimes the most effective weapon in combat isn't the most advanced one. It's the one nobody expects. Jack Churchill was born in Hong Kong in 1906 to a British civil servant family. He grew up between Asia and England, educated in expensive boarding schools where young British gentlemen learned Latin, cricket, and how to be proper members of the empire. Nothing about his early life suggested he would become one of the war's most eccentric warriors. He attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, graduated, and joined the Manchester Regiment in 1926. For a few years, he served as a perfectly normal British Army officer in Burma, doing the usual colonial garrison duties that involved a lot of parade ground drilling and not much actual fighting. But Churchill was bored out of his mind. Peacetime military service in the 1930s meant endless paperwork, rigid social hierarchies, and a lifestyle that felt more like being a bureaucrat in uniform than a soldier. In 1936, Churchill did something almost unheard of for an officer from his background. He quit. He resigned his commission and decided to become an adventurer. Churchill moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he worked as a newspaper editor and male model. Yes, male model. Mad Jack Churchill appeared in fashion photographs and advertisements, his chiseled features and military bearing making him perfect for the colonial exotic aesthetic that was popular in British media at the time. But Churchill's real passion was medieval combat. He became obsessed with archery, spending hours perfecting techniques from centuries-old manuscripts. He entered competitions and became phenomenally good at it. In 1939, just months before the war started, Churchill competed in the World Archery Championships in Oslo, Norway, representing Great Britain. He was shooting arrows competitively at the exact moment that Europe was sliding toward total war. Churchill also took up bagpipes, teaching himself to play with the same intensity he brought to everything else. And he started training with swords, studying Highland broadsword techniques and medieval combat manuals like they were holy texts. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain declared war, Churchill immediately tried to rejoin the army. He was 33 years old, technically past the preferred age for combat officers, and had been out of service for 3 years. The army could have easily rejected him. Instead, they were desperate enough for experienced officers that they took him back and assigned him to the Manchester Regiment. Churchill reported for duty carrying a sword and a longbow. His commanding officers thought he was joking. He was not joking. Churchill's first real taste of combat came in May 1940 during the Battle of France. The German blitzkrieg had torn through French defenses, and British forces were in chaotic retreat toward Dunkirk. Churchill's unit was ordered to hold a position near the village of Le Ponette to cover the evacuation. This was supposed to be a delaying action, a sacrifice play where British soldiers would slow down the German advance long enough for others to escape. Nobody expected to survive. Churchill decided that if he was going to die in France, he was going to die on his own terms. As German forces approached their position, Churchill climbed up onto an exposed piece of high ground, drew his longbow, and started shooting arrows at German soldiers. His fellow officers thought he'd lost his mind. Who brings a bow and arrow to a gunfight in 1940? But Churchill wasn't trying to win the battle with medieval weapons. He was creating psychological warfare. German soldiers who had been advancing with confidence suddenly saw a British officer shooting arrows at them like some kind of time-traveling medieval warrior. It was so unexpected, so bizarre, that it actually disrupted their attack for precious minutes while they tried to figure out what they were seeing. Churchill later claimed he killed at least one German soldier with his bow during this action, making him likely the only British soldier in World War II to get a confirmed kill with a longbow. Whether that claim is absolutely verified doesn't matter as much as what it represented. Churchill had discovered something profound about warfare. Modern soldiers are trained to expect modern weapons. When you introduce something completely outside their frame of reference, even something as primitive as a bow and arrow, it creates confusion and hesitation. And in combat, hesitation kills. After the evacuation from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for the Commandos, Britain's newly formed special forces units designed for raids and unconventional warfare. The Commandos were perfect for Churchill because they attracted exactly the kind of aggressive, slightly unhinged officers who thought conventional military doctrine was boring. Churchill fit right in. He was assigned to No. 3 Commando, and immediately began training his men in medieval combat techniques alongside modern weapons. He genuinely believed that a sword had advantages in close-quarters combat that rifles didn't, and he was determined to prove it. In December 1941, Churchill led his first major commando raid on the Norwegian island of Vagsø. The objective was to destroy German positions and gather intelligence. The raid was supposed to be a surgical strike, get in fast with surprise, accomplish objectives, and extract before the Germans could organize a proper response. Churchill had other ideas about the surprise part. As his landing craft approached the shore in the pre-dawn darkness, Churchill stood at the front, completely visible, playing his bagpipes. The Scottish War March echoed across the water, announcing their arrival to every German within earshot. His men thought he'd completely lost it. The entire point of a surprise raid is surprise, and here was their commanding officer making as much noise as humanly possible before they'd even landed. But Churchill understood something about psychological warfare that the textbooks didn't teach. The sound of bagpipes in the darkness, coming from the ocean, was so unexpected and so eerie that it actually froze German defenders for crucial seconds. They weren't hearing what they expected to hear. They were hearing something from another era, another kind of warfare, and that cognitive dissonance gave Churchill's commandos the extra moments they needed to establish their beachhead. Once on shore, Churchill led from the front with his sword drawn. He moved through the Norwegian village like a medieval berserker, clearing buildings and engaging German soldiers at close range. The raid was a complete success, destroying German positions and capturing prisoners. Churchill personally captured 42 German soldiers during the operation, herding them at sword point back to the landing craft. When questioned after the raid about why he carried a sword into combat, Churchill gave his famous response that would define his entire military philosophy. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. But Churchill's most legendary moment came in 1943 in Sicily during the Allied invasion of Italy. Churchill was now commanding No. 2 Commando, and they were tasked with capturing a German observation post in the town of Pigoletti. This wasn't supposed to be a major operation, just a quick raid to take out a position that was directing artillery fire on Allied forces. Churchill approached it like he was leading a medieval assault on a castle. He organized his men, checked his weapons, his pistol, his rifle, his sword, and his bagpipes, and then set out into the night. Churchill and his small unit moved through the Sicilian countryside under cover of darkness. When they got close to the German position, Churchill did something that still doesn't make tactical sense by any modern military standard. He stood up, walked to within clear view of the German fortification, drew his sword, and started playing his bagpipes. The sound of Scottish war music echoed through the Italian night. German soldiers, probably exhausted and nervous about Allied attacks, heard bagpipes and saw a silhouette standing in the open with a sword. They must have thought they were hallucinating. Before the Germans could fully react, Churchill charged. He led his commandos in a frontal assault on the position, his sword raised, screaming like a Highland warrior. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers, trained to fight a modern mechanized war, suddenly found themselves facing what appeared to be a madman from the Middle Ages. Some of them simply surrendered out of sheer confusion. Churchill and his tiny force captured the observation post and took 42 prisoners. Again, the number 42 keeps appearing in Churchill's combat record, with minimal Allied casualties. The operation that was supposed to be a difficult fight turned into a rout because nobody had trained German soldiers for what to do when a bagpipe-playing British officer with a sword charges their position. Churchill's most extraordinary feat of survival came in Yugoslavia in 1944. By this point in the war, Churchill had been promoted and was commanding a mixed force of British commandos and Yugoslav partisans in raids against German occupation forces. The mission was to support Tito's resistance fighters and cause havoc behind German lines. In May 1944, Churchill led his force in an attack on a German garrison on the island of Brac. The raid started well, but German reinforcements arrived faster than expected, and Churchill's force found itself badly outnumbered and outgunned. Churchill's position was being overrun. His men were being killed or captured around him, and the situation was completely hopeless. Churchill, characteristically, decided to fight to the last. He stood his ground playing his bagpipes while German soldiers closed in on his position. He later said he figured if he was going to die, he wanted to die making noise and causing as much confusion as possible. German soldiers captured him, along with several of his men, but the Germans were utterly baffled by what they'd found. They'd captured a British officer carrying a sword and bagpipes. The German commander reportedly asked Churchill if he was insane. Churchill was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Germany, and this is where his story should have ended. Thousands of Allied prisoners spent the rest of the war in captivity, waiting for liberation. Churchill lasted exactly 3 months before he escaped. In September 1944, he and a Royal Air Force officer slipped out of the camp during a nighttime electrical failure and made their way through miles of German territory on foot. They were recaptured near the Baltic coast after walking over 100 miles. Churchill was sent to a different, more secure camp in Austria. Churchill escaped again. In April 1945, as the war was clearly ending and the German military was collapsing, Churchill simply walked out of his camp and started hiking through the Alps toward Italy. He survived on stolen vegetables and whatever food he could forage. After walking through the mountains for 8 days, covering over 100 miles on foot through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, Churchill encountered an American armored column advancing through Austria. The American soldiers found this British officer, emaciated and exhausted, walking down a mountain road carrying a sword and asking for directions to the nearest Allied headquarters. Churchill's war ended in one of the most Churchill ways possible. By the time he was repatriated to British forces, Germany had surrendered. Churchill was furious that he'd missed the end of the European war because of his captivity. He immediately volunteered for transfer to Burma to fight the Japanese, stating that he wanted to get into at least one more good fight before the whole war ended. The British Army sent him to Burma, where he was training for operations when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan surrendered. Churchill was reportedly disappointed that the war ended before he could fight the Japanese. He's quoted as saying that if it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. After the war, Churchill's life continued to be gloriously eccentric. He qualified as a parachutist at age 42, well past the normal age for jump training. He served in Palestine during the tensions that preceded Israeli independence. He became a skilled surfer and is credited with being one of the first people to surf the tidal bore waves on the River Severn in England, riding the wave for miles inland on a homemade surfboard. He also became an enthusiast of radio-controlled model warships and would spend weekends staging elaborate naval battles in local ponds. Churchill retired from the military in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He lived quietly in Surrey, England, occasionally giving interviews where he would downplay his wartime exploits as nothing special, just doing his duty with the tools he preferred. He maintained that his sword and bow weren't affectations or props for psychological warfare, though they certainly served that purpose. He genuinely believed they were effective weapons in the right circumstances, in close quarters, in confined spaces, in situations where modern weapons could jam or run out of ammunition. A sword always worked. It required no maintenance, never ran out of bullets, and nobody expected it. Mad Jack Churchill died in 1996 at age 89. His obituaries in British newspapers read like something out of a historical fiction novel because nobody who read them could quite believe one man had done all those things. He'd fought through the entire Second World War using medieval weapons. He'd been captured twice and escaped twice. He'd led commando raids while playing bagpipes. He'd personally captured over 100 enemy soldiers, many of them at sword point. And he'd survived it all to become an elderly eccentric who surfed rivers and built model warships. The question that historians and military analysts have debated ever since is whether Churchill's methods actually worked, or whether he just got incredibly lucky. The truth is probably both. Churchill survived situations that should have killed him through a combination of skill, audacity, and sheer blind luck. But his tactics, as insane as they seemed, did produce results. His psychological warfare approach, using unexpected weapons and behaviors to create confusion and hesitation in enemy forces, gave his units advantages in specific situations. The bagpipes weren't just theatrical. They were a tool that disrupted enemy expectations and created openings for his men to exploit. Modern special forces still study Churchill's career, not because they're going to start issuing swords and bows to commandos, but because Churchill understood something fundamental about warfare that's still relevant. The most effective weapon isn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes it's the one your enemy doesn't expect. Churchill forced German soldiers to fight outside their training and doctrine. When you expect to be shot at with rifles and machine guns, and instead you're facing a sword-wielding maniac playing bagpipes, your training hasn't prepared you for that moment. That hesitation, that split second of confusion, can be the difference between victory and defeat. Churchill's legacy is complicated. Some military historians dismiss him as a reckless showboat who endangered his men with theatrical nonsense. Others celebrate him as an innovative commander who understood psychological warfare decades before it became a formal military discipline. The truth is probably that he was both. He was absolutely reckless by any conventional standard. He took risks that no responsible commander should take. But he was also genuinely effective, and his men followed him into impossible situations because they believed in him and because his crazy methods kept working. There's something deeply appealing about Mad Jack Churchill's story, especially to American audiences who have always loved the maverick, the individual who succeeds by breaking the rules. Churchill represents a kind of warfare that feels more human than modern combat. He fought with weapons you could see, in battles where individual courage and skill mattered more than who had the better technology. In an era of industrial warfare where millions died as anonymous statistics, Churchill was defiantly individual. You couldn't mistake him for anyone else on any battlefield in the world. There was only one British officer charging German positions with a sword while playing bagpipes. Churchill's story also raises interesting questions about the nature of heroism and sanity in warfare. Was he brave or was he crazy? The answer is probably yes to both. Combat breaks people in different ways. Some soldiers become cautious, trying to minimize risk and survive. Others become aggressive, leaning into the danger because the only way they can process the horror is to attack it. Churchill was clearly in the second category, but he channeled his aggression into something so bizarre that it became its own form of tactics. He wasn't brave in spite of his eccentricity. His eccentricity was his bravery. The weapons Churchill carried tell us something important about how he saw warfare. The sword wasn't a primitive weapon to him. It was a symbol of a different kind of fighting, where you looked your enemy in the eye and where personal courage mattered more than industrial production. The bagpipes weren't just noise. They were a connection to warrior traditions going back centuries, a reminder that soldiers had been marching into battle making as much noise as possible long before anyone invented gunpowder. Churchill was fighting a 20th century war with a warrior's mindset from another age, and somehow, and possibly, it worked. If Churchill had died in combat, he would have been remembered as a colorful footnote, a crazy British officer who got himself killed doing something stupid with a sword. But he survived. He survived everything the Germans threw at him, survived capture, survived escape attempts through hostile territory, survived 5 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. And because he survived, his story became legend. He proved that sometimes the most insane approach is the right one, that sometimes breaking every rule in the book gets better results than following doctrine, and that sometimes the man with a sword really can beat the man with a machine gun if he's crazy enough to try. Mad Jack Churchill's life reminds us that even in the most mechanized, industrialized, modern war in history, there was still room for individual warriors who fought on their own terms. He shouldn't have succeeded. By every reasonable standard, his tactics should have gotten him killed in his first engagement. But he survived and thrived because warfare isn't entirely rational, And sometimes the most irrational approach creates opportunities that rational tactics never could. He was a medieval warrior born 6 centuries too late, who found himself in the perfect war to prove that courage, audacity, and a complete disregard for what's supposed to be possible can still matter, even when everyone else is fighting with tanks and machine guns. And that's why we're still telling his story 80 years later.